Welcome to the back room. Relax, unwind, and let our soothing gangster bedtime stories guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Here we tell the quieter side of history, the childhoods, ambitions, and lives of legendary gangsters, without focusing on violence. As you settle in, share with us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is right now, and one good thing that's happened to you today. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy our stories, please like this video to support the channel, and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Your encouragement helps us bring more Mafia bedtime stories to life. Now close your eyes, feel at ease, and enjoy tonight's story. Wishing you peace and the sweetest dreams.
Rain fell softly over Palermo, not in sheets or storms, but in a patient drizzle that seemed content to linger. The streetlights glowed amber against the wet stone, casting long reflections that stretched and trembled with every passing drop. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang out, muted by the night air, their slow rhythm blending with the hush of the city. It was the kind of night that encouraged stillness when even footsteps felt intrusive. On a narrow street, police moved without urgency, their presence almost respectful, as if they were guests entering a sacred space, rather than officers closing in on one of Sicily's most elusive men. Behind the worn facade of an aging apartment building lived Pietro Aglieri, a name spoken for years only in whispers. Now on the verge of being spoken aloud, this moment, heavy with inevitability, did not arrive suddenly. It carried the weight of decades. And so, before the door opens, before the quiet confrontation unfolds, the story drifts backward, away from this rain-soaked night, into the softer shadows of post-war Sicily. Back to a time when Palermo still bore the bruises of conflict, and survival itself was a daily ritual shaped by patience and restraint. Pietro Aglieri entered this world, not amid chaos, but amid silence. His childhood unfolded in narrow rooms where voices were kept low and expressions carefully measured. The city around him was alive with tradition, faith, and an unspoken understanding that some truths were better left untouched. Churches stood as anchors in the neighborhoods, their doors open to candlelit interiors that smelled of wax and old stone. Within those walls, young Pietro learned the language of stillness. He watched adults bow their heads, not only in prayer, but in deference, to forces larger than themselves. He was a thoughtful child, more inclined to observe than to speak. While other boys filled courtyards with noise, Pietro lingered at the edges, absorbing the rhythms of his environment. He noticed how conversations shifted when certain names were mentioned, how laughter softened when unfamiliar footsteps approached. These details, subtle and easily missed, became lessons. Sicily did not teach loudly. It instructed through atmosphere. The alleyways near his home were narrow and cool, even in summer. Stone walls carried the damp scent of the sea and laundry, hung overhead like quiet flags of daily life. Old men sat on stools near doorways, their eyes attentive, their words economical. From them, Pietro learned that authority did not require volume. It existed in posture, in timing, in knowing when to remain silent. Power, in this world, was rarely announced. Faith played a steady role in shaping his inner life. The rituals of the church offered structure, repetition, and meaning. Kneeling beside his family, Pietro listened to prayers that spoke of order, obedience, and consequence. These ideas settled deep within him, not as fear, but as framework. The world made sense when it followed rules, even unspoken ones. Chaos, he learned, was not conquered by force, but by discipline. At home, life was modest and contained. Conversations at the table revolved around work, family, and survival. There was affection, but it was expressed through duty rather than display. Pietro absorbed this emotional economy, understanding that restraint was not absence, but control. He read when he could, finding comfort in words that explained human nature, morality, and purpose. Even at a young age, his curiosity leaned inward, toward understanding systems rather than breaking them. Sicily itself pressed gently but firmly upon him. The island carried a memory longer than any single life, and its people moved with an awareness of history's weight. Land ownership, loyalty, and reputation were not abstract concepts. They were lived realities shaping interactions and expectations. Pietro learned early that every action echoed, sometimes for generations. Choices mattered not only for their immediate outcome, but for how they aligned with the invisible order governing the island. There were moments, fleeting but formative, when he sensed the presence of another world operating parallel to the one. He knew it was never introduced directly. No one explained it. Instead, it revealed itself through absence, through doors that closed gently, through conversations that ended abruptly, through respect given without explanation. Pietro did not ask questions. He did not need to. He understood that some structures thrived precisely because they remained. Unseen. As he grew older, his introspection deepened. Teachers noted his intelligence, his ability to listen, to retain, to connect ideas quietly. He was not driven by rebellion or anger. If anything, he was drawn to stability. He believed that systems, when properly maintained, could protect communities from disorder. This belief would later become central to his worldview, but in these early years, it existed simply as a preference for calm over chaos. The city around him continued its slow pulse. Markets opened at dawn. Bells marked the hours. Rain came and went. Life unfolded in patterns that felt eternal. Pietro walked these streets with an awareness beyond his age, sensing that silence itself carried meaning. He learned that not everything important announced itself. Some forces shaped lives precisely because they remained in the background, and so, long before his name would be spoken in hushed tones across Palermo, long before law enforcement would track his movements with careful patience, Pietro Aglieri was already becoming who he would be. Not through violence or ambition, but through observation, discipline, and an intimate understanding of restraint. In a land where power often whispered, he learned to listen. Sicily carries its history the way the sea carries salt, quietly, endlessly, and into everything it touches. It settles into stone and skin alike, shaping behavior long before thought catches up. To understand Pietro Aglieri, one must first surrender to the island itself, because in Sicily, people are not merely born into places. They are absorbed by them. In the years after the war, the island did not rebuild with spectacle. There were no grand declarations of renewal, no sharp breaks from the past. Sicily recovered the way it always had, slowly, inwardly, and without apology. Power structures did not vanish when uniforms changed. They adapted, folded inward, and waited. Families remained families. Obligations remained obligations. Memory was treated not as history, but as instruction. Villages seemed suspended in time. Sunlight spilled over tiled rooftops and cracked stone walls, warming streets where footsteps echoed gently rather than sharply. Old men occupied the same chairs outside cafes each afternoon, speaking softly, as if loud voices might disturb something sacred. Their conversations moved in circles, weather, harvests, familiar grievances, yet beneath the repetition lay something deeper, continuity. Nothing truly ended here. It only shifted shape. For a young boy like Pietro, this atmosphere was not oppressive, was stabilizing. The world around him followed rules that were rarely written but universally understood. You learned them by watching. You learned them by noticing who spoke, who listened, and who remained silent. Silence itself was never empty. It carried meaning, authority, and sometimes warning. Religion reinforced this structure gently but persistently. Churches stood at the heart of communities not merely as spiritual centers, but as moral anchors. Inside, candlelight flickered against stone walls worn smooth by centuries of devotion. The air smelled of wax and incense, heavy with ritual. Sermons spoke of obedience, humility, and order. Sin was acknowledged as human, but chaos was not forgiven. Redemption, when offered, was slow and deliberate. Pietro listened carefully. Faith appealed to him not as comfort alone, but as system. It offered boundaries. It explained consequence. It suggested that power, when guided correctly, could be righteous rather than reckless. This was not a world that celebrated rebellion. It respected restraint. As Pietro grew older, Sicily's lessons deepened. Adolescence did not arrive with dramatic defiance or youthful explosions. It arrived quietly, through observation. Young men learned that ambition was acceptable only when tempered by loyalty. To stand out too brightly was to invite scrutiny. To move carefully was to endure. The island taught discipline without shouting. Order was maintained through expectation, rather than enforcement. You behaved correctly because deviation felt unnatural, even shameful. Pietro absorbed this instinctively. He admired systems that endured without needing explanation. He respected authority that did not need to announce. Itself. The underworld, when it brushed against daily life, did so indirectly. There were no introductions, no dramatic revelations. It existed in absence. Certain names were never spoken aloud. Certain men were referred to vaguely, if at all. Doors closed softly instead of slamming. Conversations shifted tone when unfamiliar. Footsteps approached. Pietro noticed these patterns. He understood that secrecy was not fear-driven, it was strategic. Information was handled carefully because it mattered. Power was not displayed because it did not need validation. This quiet confidence intrigued him more than any show of force ever could. Education, too, carried a different meaning here. Intelligence was respected, but only when paired with discretion. Curiosity was tolerated when it served understanding, not exposure. Pietro's mind leaned naturally toward reflection. He read, thought, and asked questions inwardly rather than aloud. His interest gravitated toward morality, obedience, and control, not as abstractions, but as lived realities. Sicily did not frame power as domination. It framed it as balance. A man earned legitimacy not by intimidation, but by reliability. The most influential figures were often the least visible. Their authority existed in consensus rather than command, daily. Life reinforced these values constantly. Markets operated on trust built over decades. Favors were remembered longer than debts. Reputation mattered more than wealth. A careless word could travel faster than truth, and silence could preserve stability longer than explanation. Pietro learned patience. He learned that timing mattered more than speed. Impulsiveness was treated as immaturity. The island respected men who waited, who observed, who acted only when action was necessary, and then acted decisively. Even leisure was instructive. Afternoon walks revealed invisible boundaries. Certain cafes belonged to certain circles, not by signage, but by understanding. A glance could signal acceptance or exclusion. Pietro learned to read rooms before entering them. He learned that respect was a form of currency, spent sparingly and earned slowly. By the time Pietro approached adulthood, Sicily had already done its work. It had shaped him not through hardship alone, but through coherence. The world made sense when hierarchy was respected, when loyalty was preserved, when silence was honored. Violence was not romanticized here. It was seen as inefficient, a failure of control rather than proof of strength. True power endured because it did not need constant correction. Pietro internalized this philosophy without ever naming it. It simply felt correct. There was no defining moment when his future changed direction. No dramatic turning point. Instead, there was a gradual narrowing of possibility. Sicily offered roles, not fantasies. One learned where one belonged by observing who was trusted, who was deferred to, and who was obeyed. Pietro found himself drawn toward order rather than chaos, toward structure rather than spectacle, toward systems that promised continuity. As evening settled over the island, shadows stretched long across quiet streets. Church bells marked the hour, conversations softened. Somewhere within this calm, a young man continued to watch and absorb. Sicily did not push him forward. It aligned him. The storm forming around Pietro Aglieri was not loud. It did not announce itself. It was patient, deeply rooted, and already part of him, and like Sicily itself, it would endure. No one ever told Pietro Aglieri that he was being invited into anything. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no threshold marked by sound or gesture. Instead, there was only a quiet shift in how people looked at him, how conversations paused when he entered a room, how questions were asked with just enough space between words to allow refusal without offense. The invisible order did not open its doors. It simply made room. The first invitation arrived disguised as routine. An afternoon espresso shared at a small table, pushed against a cafe wall darkened by age and smoke. The cup cooled slowly between Pietro's hands as an older man spoke about ordinary things, the weather, a mutual acquaintance, a delivery that had arrived late. Nothing in the words themselves suggested significance. Meaning lived elsewhere. In tone, in timing, in what was not said. Pietro listened more than he spoke. He had learned long ago that listening was a form of participation. Silence was not absence. It was presence restrained. When the man asked him what he thought, Pietro answered carefully, not with opinion, but with observation. He did not criticize. He did not suggest improvement. He simply described what he had noticed. The answer was enough. After that afternoon, the invitations continued, always indirect. A request to accompany someone on an errand. A question about whether a message had been delivered correctly. A quiet confirmation that something had occurred exactly as expected. Each task was small, almost trivial, but together they formed a pattern. Pietro understood that he was being watched, not suspiciously, but attentively. The rooms where these conversations took place were unremarkable. Dim apartments with heavy curtains drawn against the sun. Kitchens that smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. Tables scarred by years of use. Nothing was extravagant. Nothing needed to be. Power here did not express itself through display. It expressed itself through certainty. Pietro's role remained undefined, which suited him. He was not asked to prove himself through force. No one tested his courage. Instead, they tested his restraint. They watched whether he repeated what he heard. They noted how he reacted to information that carried weight. They observed whether his curiosity spilled outward or stayed contained. He passed these tests without knowing they were tests at all. In time, Pietro began to sense the structure beneath the surface. This was not disorder masquerading as control. It was order operating without explanation. There were rules here, but they were not written. There was hierarchy, but it did not announce itself. Authority moved quietly, like pressure beneath stone. Found this comforting. The Mafia, as he came to understand it, did not feel like a rupture from the world he knew. It felt like a continuation. The same values governed both spaces: loyalty, discretion, patience. The same belief that stability mattered more than impulse. The same understanding that power should be felt, not flaunted. Violence existed, but it lived at the edges of awareness. It was present the way a shadow is present, proof of form, not substance. No one described it. No one needed to. The absence of certain individuals spoke loudly enough. Pietro noticed when names stopped being mentioned, when chairs remained empty without comment. The silence carried its own explanation. As weeks turned into months, responsibility increased incrementally. Pietro was trusted with information that required accuracy. A misunderstanding could create tension. A misplaced word could disturb balance. He handled these moments with care, verifying details, confirming intentions, allowing no room for confusion. His discipline was noted. What drew attention was not brilliance, but reliability. Pietro did not seek recognition. He did not position himself at the center of conversations. He did not rush, he waited. In a world that rewarded composure, patience distinguished him more than ambition ever could. Privately, he rationalized his involvement with clarity. He did not see himself as stepping into criminality. He saw himself aligning with an alternative system of governance. The state existed, distant and abstract. This order existed here, tangible and immediate. It resolved disputes. It enforced agreements. It maintained equilibrium. He told himself that every society required structure. That chaos filled the spaces where authority failed. That morality without enforcement was sentiment. These thoughts did not trouble him. They settled comfortably, reinforced by the calm competence of those around him. There were moments of hesitation, brief and quiet. Instances when Pietro felt the weight of permanence pressing closer. A conversation that ended with a look held a second too long. A task that carried implications beyond its surface. In these moments, he felt the narrowing of possibility. But doubt never bloomed fully. The path he walked felt deliberate, not accidental. The deeper commitment came without ceremony. A conversation held late in the evening. A request framed as trust rather than demand. Pietro understood what was being offered and what would be expected in return. He understood that withdrawal would no longer be neutral. Silence would now mean loyalty, not distance. He accepted without flourish. That night, as he walked through, streets washed clean by recent rain, the city felt unchanged. Lamps glowed softly, footsteps echoed, life continued. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Pietro was no longer adjacent to power. He was inside its current. He felt no triumph, no fear. Only alignment. The invisible order did not welcome him. It absorbed him. And as he disappeared into its quiet structure, Pietro Aglieri believed calmly, sincerely, that he had chosen order over disorder. In the quiet corners of Palermo, where sunlight struggled to pierce the narrow alleys and the scent of salt from the distant sea mingled with the earthy aroma of old stone, Pietro Aglieri began to distinguish himself from the men who surrounded him. Unlike many in Cosa Nostra, whose reputations were built on sudden violence, whispered threats, or impulsive displays of power, Aglieri moved with a measured rhythm. He observed, considered, and acted only when his mind had traced every potential outcome, like a chess master surveying a board centuries old. The city itself seemed to bend to his patience. Cobblestones that had borne generations of secrets echoed with the soft steps of those who respected his silence, and the faint, almost imperceptible creak of shutters opening and closing carried the acknowledgement of his presence without need for words. Aglieri's rise did not rely on brute force, but on intellectual dominance. He spent long hours in quiet rooms, poring over texts on philosophy, ethics, and theology, letting ideas ferment slowly in his mind. While others celebrated their impulsive conquests, he considered consequences, mapping connections, alliances, and hierarchies that were invisible to all but the most disciplined observer. The meetings he attended were deliberate, almost ceremonial. Espresso cups cooled slowly on tables, paper crinkled under the weight of meticulously recorded notes, and conversations unfolded in measured tones, where the silence between words carried as much meaning as the words themselves. He learned to listen, to read subtle shifts in posture, tone, and gaze, understanding that true control often arrived not with a gun, but with perception. The contrast between Aglieri and the men around him was striking. Violence erupted quickly. In Palermo, sudden gunshots at dusk, fleeting but decisive power plays, the hum of motorbikes weaving through crowded streets after a warning had been delivered. And yet, Aglieri remained detached, almost impervious. He saw violence as a mechanism, a tool of the organization, not a personal expression of anger or dominance. Where others reacted, he reflected. Where others blustered, he calculated. This detachment became both his shield and his moral fracture, for while he did not crave bloodshed, he accepted it as inevitable within the system he inhabited. The city itself mirrored his temperament. Ancient churches stood in stoic silence, their bell towers casting long shadows across stone courtyards. Families murmured prayers in dim candlelight, while the distant clatter of street life persisted outside. Each narrow alley whispered of history, of codes carried across centuries, and Aglieri absorbed these whispers, translating them into an understanding of loyalty, obligation, and power. He recognized that influence in Palermo was rarely declared. It was observed, sensed, and respected without overt acknowledgement. To exist within Cosa Nostra was to navigate these invisible currents, and Aglieri proved adept at reading them, bending to the tides when necessary and asserting quiet authority. When opportunity arrived, social interactions reinforced his philosophy. Older men, long entrenched in the mafia, gravitated toward him not because he displayed brute strength, but because he offered clarity. His intelligence became a resource. He would propose solutions to conflicts before they escalated, mediate tensions with subtle argumentation, and maintain the delicate balance between respect and fear. Younger recruits observed him closely, sensing that his calm demeanor was a form of power, one that required no outburst to assert itself. In dimly lit cafes, across espresso-stained tables, he taught the importance of patience and perception. Every pause, every carefully chosen phrase, became a lesson in discipline. Aglieri's internal life expanded alongside his external influence. He meditated on morality, questioning the nature of obedience and loyalty within a framework that demanded both. Was power merely the ability to command, or was it the capacity to understand and anticipate the desires and fears of others? He wrestled quietly with this question, never seeking to articulate it aloud, allowing it instead to inform his every decision. His mind became a lattice of potentialities, each scenario considered before movement, each action weighed against. The invisible ledger of consequence. Even the rhythms of daily life were subject to his observation. The scratch of a pen across paper, the echo of footsteps in an empty hall, the slow rise of morning sunlight across terracotta rooftops, all became markers of timing, of opportunity. The Mafia, Aglieri realized, thrived not on rash action but on rhythm, repetition, and ritual. By mastering these, he could anticipate rival moves, prevent crises, and cultivate loyalty without the need for coercion. Power, he understood, was as much psychological as physical, yet beneath this calm, there existed tension, subtle and persistent. Palermo was a city where history pressed against every wall, where codes could shift without notice, and where unseen forces measured and punished over decades. Aglieri felt the weight of that history keenly. Each choice carried echoes, each alignment demanded vigilance. The men around him might have relied on force, but he relied on foresight. And foresight required patience, a patience he cultivated with almost monastic discipline, even as he recognized the fragility of such equilibrium. By the end of this chapter, Aglieri emerged as a figure fundamentally different from those who surrounded him. He was the thinker among killers, the philosopher in the corridors of silence, the quiet architect of influence. His approach combined intellect with strategic patience, detachment with observation, and reflection with decisive action. In a world defined by immediate violence, he understood that true power often arrived in whispers, in measured silence, in the subtle rearrangement of loyalties and perceptions. And so Pietro Aglieri stepped fully into his new role, aware that the path he walked demanded a mind sharper than any blade, a patience longer than any night, and a quiet that could outlast the gunshots echoing through Palermo's alleys. He did not yet rule. He observed, he learned, he calculated, but in doing so, he planted the seeds of a philosophy that would carry him to heights few within Cosa Nostra would ever reach. His rise would be measured, almost invisible to the untrained eye, yet inevitable. To those who understood the weight of thought in a world ruled by shadows out in the labyrinthine streets of Palermo, Pietro Aglieri had grown into a figure whose presence was known not for flamboyance, nor for the thunder of violent acts, but for the calm, unyielding certainty with which he navigated the currents of power. The city moved around him, a network of alleys, piazzas, and shadowed stairways, each whispering with histories of ambition and betrayal. Yet he remained a study in composed vigilance. Leadership for Aglieri was never about spectacle. It was about the precise management of relationships, information, and expectation. He watched, listened, and measured, allowing the city's pulse to guide his decisions. And in that quiet attentiveness, he commanded more than many could with brute force. Within the walls of his carefully maintained sanctuaries, Aglieri pored over papers, letters, and ledgers, tracking movements, debts, and loyalties with the meticulousness of a scholar. Every message that passed through his network carried his unseen signature. Every minor dispute resolved without escalation bore the mark of his patience. He had learned in the slow rhythm of years that true control often lies in absence. The absence of rash action, of overt display, of unnecessary speech. Even the most volatile elements of Palermo's underworld began to move according to patterns he had set, almost imperceptibly, yet irrevocably. Emotionally, this height of influence brought solitude. The rooms filled with books and the dim glow of lamps became both refuge and prison. He reflected on faith, morality, and the consequences of choices made in silence. There was pride in the efficiency of order, yet a subtle tension lingered behind. His eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that power is never free from vigilance. Each day required renewed attention. Each decision a reminder of responsibility and fragility. Aglieri's inner circle respected him not for dramatic dominance, but for his predictability, his constancy, his calm judgment. Fear was present, but tempered by admiration. Loyalty was maintained, not demanded. The philosophy he had cultivated of restraint, calculation, and intellectual authority set him apart in an era when many rose and fell through noise and violence. His influence reached deep into the structures of Cosa Nostra, yet he remained almost imperceptible, a shadow that organized shadows. Beyond the walls of his residences, Palermo carried on in its ordinary rhythm, market stalls opening with the pave, scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee, church bells tolling over sunlit squares, children running through stone courtyards. But the machinery of order Aglieri had woven operated beneath the surface. Disputes that might have erupted into chaos were diffused before they surfaced. Alliances that seemed fragile were maintained. With precise interventions, subtle gestures, and the authority of presence that needed no display. His mind, ever restless, calculated the repercussions of every movement, every whisper, every unspoken threat. The weight of command pressed constantly. Trust was no longer freely given. Friendships were measured, alliances scrutinized. Nights in quiet rooms with worn volumes of philosophy and law offered respite, but never absolution. Mortality, ethics, and the fragility of human life were never far from thought. He moved as a man who understood that invisibility is both a shield and a trap, that restraint can command respect but cannot entirely protect from the unfolding of fate. Aglieri's influence extended beyond Palermo itself. Messages, carefully coded, traveled through networks of messengers and intermediaries, crossing the island, reaching small villages where the code of Cosa Nostra had long been lived but rarely understood fully, even as rivals whispered in taverns. Or behind closed doors, the unseen structure he had built maintained balance. The art of restraint became his signature, the ability to guide without revealing, to shape outcomes without declaring intent. Yet even the quietest rain carries its own burdens. Aglieri spent hours contemplating the human cost of order, the sacrifices of those who worked under him, the necessity of decisions that weighed heavy on conscience. He understood that power, exercised silently, can never be entirely separated from consequence. There was a loneliness to such mastery, a slow erosion of casual connection. Every smile, every handshake, every nod required calculation, and the weight of expectation pressed upon him, unseen but palpable. Even as he consolidated control, there was a subtle foreshadowing of forces beyond his awareness. The state patient and methodical observed without intrusion. Investigators, bureaucrats, and prosecutors, unseen and unheard, traced patterns, noting subtle shifts in the balance of power. Aglieri moved as though invisible, yet the quiet scrutiny of those outside Palermo, the patient mechanisms of justice and consequence, were threading slowly through the web he had woven. The soft inevitability of time and law reminded him that restraint, while protective, was not omnipotent. By the chapter's close, listeners sense a man at the apex of influence, whose command is nearly absolute, yet quietly precarious. Aglieri stands at the center of Palermo's hidden world, a stabilizing force amidst chaos, his crown not forged in violence but in observation, patience, and intellect. The streets hum with normalcy, yet beneath that surface, a network pulses under his unseen hand, precise and exacting. There is no grandeur, no triumphal flourish, only the recognition that leadership is a continuous burden, that even the most careful crown carries weight, and that patience, discipline, and intellect are both shield and tether. In this quiet mastery, the audience feels the tension. A man who believes himself untouchable may, in the patient unfolding of time, discover the limitations even of intellect, calculation, and calm. Shadows stretch long across Palermo's alleys, and beneath their cool stone, the mechanisms of loyalty, fear, and obligation turn silently, bound by the hand of the philosopher Mafioso, whose crown is heavy, invisible, and eternal. In the quiet streets of Palermo, a city still dripping with the heat of day, shadows lengthened with a deliberate patience, unnoticed by the pedestrians moving home under the waning sun. Pietro Aglieri moved among them like any other man, measured steps, hands tucked into his coat pockets, eyes alert yet calm. Yet beneath this composed exterior, a subtle tension had begun to ripple through his life, one that was neither violent nor immediate, but insistent and unavoidable. The state, he sensed, was no longer a distant abstraction. It had begun to observe, to chart, to understand, with the slow, precise patience of a surgeon at work. The investigators approached their work without haste. In dim offices far from the city's clamor, folders multiplied on polished desks, tapes were played and replayed, and notes were scribbled in near silence. Every call, every meeting, every movement of the mafia was parsed, measured, and filed. They were patient, relentless, and entirely methodical, understanding that the power of men like Aglieri was built on habit and predictability, where others might have rushed to dramatic confrontation. They waited, knowing that the empire itself would eventually betray its own rhythms. Aglieri, meanwhile, sensed the tightening atmosphere. Meetings that once felt open now seemed edged with caution. Couriers lingered longer at street corners, conversations became clipped, and the usual hum of Palermo, the clatter of shutters, the distant shouts of children, the persistent ring of church bells felt heavier, carrying with it the weight of unseen observation. His mind, always a careful calculator of risk, adjusted, compartmentalized, refined. His eyes scanned streets more thoroughly. His fingers hesitated over the edges of letters. His steps through corridors were measured to avoid patterns. The invisible pressure of scrutiny was like water slowly filling a vessel, silent yet inevitable. Psychologically, the intrusion of the state forced changes both subtle and profound. Trust became a currency more precious than gold. Associates, who had once been entirely reliable, now aroused brief flickers of suspicion. Conversations, once free and flowing, were interrupted by the thought of ears listening, of notes being taken, of conclusions being drawn in rooms far from the warmth of Palermo's sunlit piazzas. Even the smallest gestures, the lowering of a voice, a delayed greeting, a glance that lingered too long, were interpreted, catalogued, and reconsidered. Aglieri understood that mastery over men and territory could no longer guarantee mastery over information, and that the empire he had so carefully cultivated could be observed, without a single gun ever being raised. The chapter of surveillance unfolded quietly, almost imperceptibly. Cars that idled at the far end of streets, unremarkable yet deliberate, signaled that eyes had been placed. Phones rang into silence. The receiver returned to its cradle without a conversation taking place. The rhythms of routine, the visits to markets, the exchange of small tokens of trust, the measured arrangements of meetings, began to shift under the subtle hand of observation. There were no sudden arrests, no dramatic confrontations, only the soft compression of space and freedom, the slow squeeze of the world pressing inward. Aglieri's discipline, which had once been a source of effortless control, now became armor. He moved with greater care, his choices filtered through layers of thought, anticipating the unseen gaze. He observed more than he acted, recorded more than he spoke, weighed more than he committed. The solitude of contemplation became a shield. Reflection, a necessary tool for survival. Yet within this tightening framework, there was no panic, no impulsive flight. Each movement was deliberate, each decision a quiet assertion of the control he still possessed. He knew that visibility to the state was dangerous, but invisibility was not a guarantee. It was a task, an ongoing calculation that the tension between empire and observation was not loud. It was atmospheric. Palermo itself seemed to mirror this shift. Alleyways felt narrower, voices of neighbors quieter, windows closed with slightly more care. Even the city's ancient stones, warm from decades of sun, seemed to carry the weight of patience and expectation. There was a quiet poetry in the unfolding inevitability. The empire had grown too large to remain unobserved, and the state, in its methodical patience, would let the consequences emerge in their own time, emotionally. Aglieri's world became a delicate balance of calculation and restraint. Pride in his network, in its order and reach, was tempered by the awareness of vulnerability. The men who once followed without hesitation were now weighed against the potential of betrayal. Every courier, every note, every exchange of money and message was reconsidered through the lens of observation. The psychological landscape of leadership had shifted. Control over territory was no longer sufficient. Now survival demanded mastery of perception, anticipation, and the silent currents of information that flowed unseen. By the end of this quiet, inexorable chapter, the listener feels the subtle compression of power and freedom. The streets, the offices, the networks, all are alive with observation, yet the true force remains invisible, almost poetic in its patience. Aglieri realizes without shock or drama that invisibility is no longer guaranteed. The state's eyes are watching, calculating, waiting. And within this awareness, he understands that every decision henceforth carries a weight magnified not by immediate danger, but by the slow, deliberate certainty of attention. It is a lesson in restraint, vigilance, and the quiet inevitability of consequence, a reminder that even the most disciplined man must bow, at least in thought, to the eyes of the state. In the quiet chambers of his Palermo home, Pietro Aglieri sat alone, the flicker of candlelight tracing the contours of his thoughtful face. The air carried the faint scent of incense, mingling with the must of old books stacked carefully on the shelves. Outside, the city moved in measured rhythms, church bells tolling across narrow streets, a dog barking in the distance, the faint shuffle of feet on cobblestones. Within these walls, time seemed to slow, as if the world outside had paused to allow reflection, contemplation, and the quiet confrontation of conscience. Aglieri had long recognized that power demanded justification, that influence could not exist without an internal architecture of reasoning. Faith and philosophy had become his scaffolding, a means to frame choices that would otherwise carry unbearable weight. He opened a worn volume of Thomistic writings, letting the words of St. Thomas Aquinas settle around him, drawing him into a space where morality, law, and duty intertwined. Each sentence resonated differently than it might have in a lecture hall or monastery. Here, it became a lens through which he could measure action, assess consequence, and navigate the subtle complexities of leadership. Prayer was another constant, a ritual both grounding and elevating. Kneeling on the cool tiles, the soft rhythm of repetition echoed in his mind. Words of supplication and confession were offered not for absolution alone, but for clarity, for a sense of alignment between thought and deed. The contrast between these moments of spiritual quiet and the decisions that governed life and death in Palermo was stark. He could feel it, the tension between the gentle authority of faith and the hard realities of his world. Every choice carried weight, yet every choice also required justification, a narrative that allowed action to coexist with conscience. This internal architecture of reason extended beyond prayer and scripture into philosophy. Aglieri read voraciously, turning to classical texts, to Machiavelli, to modern reflections on authority and ethics. He was drawn to systems of thought that examined power as an instrument, that explored the responsibilities and burdens of leadership. The study of philosophy was not a hobby. It was a tool, a framework that allowed him to interpret his own actions, to assign meaning to the violence, discipline, and subtle manipulations that defined his life. He considered violence not as cruelty, for its own sake, but as a mechanism of order, a language that maintained structure where chaos threatened to prevail. The emotional tension within Aglieri was subtle but pervasive. He felt the dissonance between the contemplative self and the executor of decisions, a duality that never fully reconciled. In quiet moments, he traced his finger along the spine of a leather-bound book, sensing the fragility of his internal equilibrium. The weight of responsibility was heavy, not only because of the potential for miscalculation, but because every decision reverberated beyond his immediate perception. Families, neighborhoods, and lives were bound, even indirectly, to the calculus of his authority. Yet in this tension, Aglieri found coherence. Philosophy provided language, faith provided context, and reflection provided a kind of sanctuary from the ever-present pressures of reality. In the silence, he rehearsed justifications, imagined conversations, and considered the moral equations that would allow him to sleep at night, despite the consequences of his choices. Every meeting, every directive, every calculated act of enforcement was filtered through this prism of thought. To outsiders, his life may have appeared ruthless, detached, or morally ambiguous, but within, it was a constant negotiation between principle and pragmatism, between duty and self-preservation. The contrast between contemplation and action was not only psychological, but also deeply sensory. The flickering candlelight cast shifting shadows across the walls as Aglieri moved through routines of reflection. The pages of books turned softly, a sound magnified in the stillness. Outside, the distant clatter of shutters and the low murmur of voices reminded him that the city continued in its unrelenting rhythms, oblivious to the silent calculations unfolding behind closed doors. He could feel the pulse of Palermo, the slow oscillation between order and disorder, mirrored in the oscillation of his own thoughts between moral scrutiny and operational necessity. Even as he sought alignment between faith and action, Aglieri wrestled with self-deception. He recognized the danger of rationalization, the subtle seduction of framing acts of violence as duties or inevitabilities. Yet he also understood that without such frameworks, leadership could become unbearable. The quiet moments of prayer, the rigorous study of philosophy, and the patient observation of human behavior were not indulgences. They were essential structures supporting a life that demanded precision, detachment, and paradoxically, empathy. For the consequences he could not always prevent, this inner world was a fortress as much as his outward power was. Where others relied on fear, intimidation, or spectacle, Aglieri relied on contemplation, reflection, and the disciplined alignment of thought and action. He became a philosopher within a world of executioners, a man whose greatest strength was not force, but the careful balance between reason, duty, and consequence. By the end of this chapter, the audience sees Aglieri not as merely a criminal figure, nor simply a strategist, but as a man in quiet dialogue with his conscience. Every prayer, every philosophical text, every night spent in reflective isolation builds a portrait of a leader whose conflicts are internal first and foremost. The moral tension that underpins every decision, the delicate architecture of justification, and the intellectual rigor applied to acts of authority illuminate a complexity often unseen from the outside. The chapter closes on a soft introspective note, Aglieri kneeling in the flickering candlelight, contemplating a life where power is inseparable from reflection, and violence is inseparable from reasoning, a man both at peace and in perpetual negotiation with himself. Rain fell gently on the uneven cobblestones of Palermo, each droplet catching the dim glow of street lamps and turning the narrow alleys into rivers of liquid silver. The city moved quietly around him, unaware that one of its most disciplined sons, Pietro Aglieri, was about to experience a pause so absolute that even the streets seemed to hold their breath. Inside a modest apartment, the air smelled of old wood, inked papers, and faint smoke, a signature of long nights spent in contemplation. Light filtered through heavy curtains, casting soft shadows across bookshelves lined with texts on philosophy, theology, and the histories of Sicily itself. Every object seemed immobile, waiting, as if anticipating what was about to unfold. There was no dramatic pounding on doors. No sirens pierced the night. Instead, the law arrived with measured certainty, the patience of time itself embodied in quiet footsteps that echoed along the hallway. Agents entered with an economy of motion, their authority carried not in voice but in presence. They moved methodically, cataloging papers, gently lifting small items, closing drawers with almost ceremonial care. The subtlety of their movements emphasized the weight of inevitability. This was not a chase, not a spectacle. It was the natural conclusion of decades of observation, calculation, and quiet influence. Aglieri, as always, remained composed. He did not flinch. He did not speak unnecessarily. Standing by the window, he observed the rain sliding down the panes, tracing streaks like the slow passage of time itself. In his mind, every step of this life had led to this moment, the quiet threshold between freedom and reflection. His years of careful navigation through power, loyalty, and philosophy had not prepared him for drama, because his life had always operated on calm precision. Now, even as agents moved through his apartment, gathering evidence and closing doors, he felt the serenity of inevitability. The silence was profound. Every sound, the soft rustle of papers, the gentle clink of filing cabinets, the distant hum of cars outside, became magnified in the hushed apartment. Time seemed to elongate, each second stretching to accommodate the weight of consequence. Aglieri's mind wandered, recalling the long corridors of his past, childhood streets bathed in evening light, silent lessons from elders about honor and restraint, the careful study of texts that had shaped his worldview. He reflected on moments of subtle influence, decisions made with deliberation rather than impulse, and the quiet victories of intellect over force. Each memory threaded together into a tapestry of inevitability, each strand pulling him toward the present with calm inevitability. The arrest itself was devoid of dramatics. There were no raised voices, no forced maneuvers, no panic. Agents moved through the apartment as if honoring a ritual, guiding the transition from one stage of life to another. Aglieri followed without resistance, his mind cataloging the small details of the room, the worn edges of chairs, the faint aroma of ink, the texture of polished wood under his fingertips. Even as the apartment emptied of its familiar order, he remained unshaken, accepting the moment as another stage in the deliberate rhythm of his existence. As he was escorted down the narrow staircase and into a waiting vehicle, the world outside continued unabated. Palermo breathed, unaware of the calm man passing through its streets. Rain drummed gently on the roof, punctuating the silent passage with a steady cadence. Inside the car, Aglieri's thoughts drifted to patterns of human behavior, the fragility of systems built on secrecy, and the impermanence of power. Even as doors closed and locks clicked, there was no anxiety, only the reflective acceptance of inevitability. The city's textures, the glint of wet stone, the muted conversations from distant windows, the flicker of street lamps in puddles moved past him slowly, each image a reminder of the world beyond his immediate control. And yet, within him, there was an internal order. Decades of discipline had prepared him for this quiet confrontation with authority. He recognized that true power was never in evasion or spectacle, but in understanding, preparation, and composure. Each breath he took in the confined space of the vehicle resonated with decades of thought, reflection, and patient calculation. When the apartment's door finally closed behind him, it echoed softly, a punctuation mark in the narrative of a life built on silence. The agent's presence receded, leaving behind a room that was both ordinary and monumental, a place where the past and future intersected in stillness. Aglieri's calm remained unbroken as he traveled to an uncertain destination. He carried with him the clarity that had always defined his existence, a recognition that life unfolds in quiet increments, and that the measure of a man is revealed not in the noise of events, but in the steadiness of his response. By the end of this chapter, the arrest is fully absorbed into the psychological narrative rather than the sensational. The city continues its rhythms, indifferent to the man moving through it, yet every detail, the rain, the soft lighting, the ambient murmurs, amplifies the reflective atmosphere. The listener understands that Aglieri's quiet arrest is more than an event. It is the convergence of a life of discipline, foresight, and restraint with the external forces that can no longer be deferred. His journey now moves inward into reflection, philosophy, and the recalibration of a life that has always existed on the threshold of thought and action. The walls of the prison had a stillness that pressed against every sense, a quiet so complete that even the smallest sound, a distant footstep, the scrape of a metal chair, the turning of a page, felt amplified. Pietro Aglieri moved through this confined world with a practiced calm, his footsteps measured, his gaze steady, yet behind that composure lay a mind endlessly tracing the paths that had led him here. He awoke each morning to the same filtered sunlight, slipping through narrow, barred windows, casting long angular shadows that divided the cold concrete floors into fragments of time. The air was heavy with the scent of disinfectant, damp stone, and the faint musk of human presence. Every corridor, every locked door, seemed to echo with memory and silence in equal measure. In these hours, Aglieri's thoughts turned inward. He revisited the quiet streets of Palermo, the sun-warmed stones of his childhood neighborhood, and the faces of mentors who had once guided him with measured authority. Each memory was a fragment, sometimes sharp and clear, sometimes softened by distance. He thought of decisions that had once seemed minor and instruction given in a whisper, a loyalty earned through patience, and how those moments had shaped the architecture of his life. In solitude, the pattern of cause and consequence unfolded, with clarity, revealing both mastery and miscalculation. The routine of prison life imposed a rhythm, and within it, reflection became both a discipline and a companion. The mechanical repetition of meals, roll calls, And evening counts allowed Aglieri the space to explore his own mind, to trace ambitions alongside regrets. He wrote letters that traveled through unseen channels, folding his thoughts into careful lines, sometimes philosophical, sometimes practical, always measured. Even the act of writing was meditative, each word a conscious assertion against the eroding quiet. Time itself felt altered. Minutes stretched into hours, hours into days yet. Each brought the same opportunity for reflection. He considered the responsibilities he had carried, the network of alliances, the subtle exercises of influence that had once defined him. Now influence existed as memory and pattern, abstracted from action. He found both solace and tension in this abstraction. Solace in the fact that his mind remained agile, still able to reason and plan within a confined framework. Tension in the awareness that freedom, in every material sense, had been surrendered. Pietro's perception of the outside world became filtered, almost spectral. He listened to snippets of conversation through vents, sensed the rhythm of daily life passing beyond thick walls, and imagined the unfolding of events that he could no longer steer. His relationships, once orchestrated with precision, now existed only as echoes, carried by letters or fleeting visitors. Trust was distilled to a point of scarcity. Each interaction weighed, measured, and analyzed. Solitude magnified observation, and observation became a careful study of both self and circumstance. Despite the confinement, Aglieri maintained the contours of thought that had long distinguished him. Philosophy, theology, and personal reflection intertwined, creating a framework through which he evaluated past choices. He considered the duality of action and consequence, the moral calculus that had justified certain measures and the unforeseen ripple effects they had caused. Memory became a canvas, and within it, he traced each strategic move, each decision steeped in both necessity and ambition. The act of revisiting did not carry bitterness. It carried understanding, a deliberate parsing of what had been gained and lost. The monotony of routine also afforded quiet observation of those around him. He noted the gestures, the habits, the subtle negotiations and hierarchies that continued within the prison walls. Even here, human behavior followed patterns. These observations reinforced lessons learned long before: patience as power, silence as leverage, and the careful weighing of action against risk. Every glance, every pause, every whispered exchange became material for understanding human nature. In this reduced space, influence existed not through command, but through perception. Evenings brought a particular clarity. The fading light cast long shadows across the walls, and the wind, carrying distant city scents, whispered through gaps in the structure. Aglieri would often pause, feeling the cold brush against his skin, and allow memory and thought to converge. He revisited the moments of ascension, the quiet victories, the careful maintenance of order that had marked his reign. In contrast, the inevitability of decline pressed close, and reflection deepened, touching both pride and humility. Isolation did not erase identity, it sharpened it. The external world was diminished, but the internal one expanded. Pietro measured each thought, each memory, each lesson, turning them over with deliberate care. He contemplated mortality, legacy, and the transience of influence. The silence of prison became a mirror, reflecting not only what had been, but what might have been under different choices. In the yard, when permitted, he would stand alone, feeling wind against his face, sunlight filtered and weak, yet persistent. In those moments, time seemed to fold, the city beyond the walls distant, yet insistent. The world continued, indifferent to past power, and yet within this small, quiet space, Aglieri maintained the integrity of mind and principle. Life had been reduced to silence, to repetition, to observation, but within that reduction, he found clarity. Reflection became both refuge and reckoning. the measure of a life lived with discipline, intellect, and consequence. Here, behind bars, Pietro Aglieri discovered the true weight of action, the quiet persistence of memory, and the enduring pulse of human thought that even confinement could not fully erase. Palermo carries memory like the slow accumulation of sediment along its ancient streets. The city's stone walls, sun-warmed and weathered, hold stories that pass silently from one generation to the next, whispered in the cadence of daily life, yet never fully revealed. Rain often falls lightly, tapping across clay rooftops, trickling along narrow alleyways and pooling in the uneven cobblestones that have borne witness to centuries of history. In this soft, persistent quiet, the echoes of Pietro Aglieri remain not as the loud roar of legend, but as the measured whisper of a man whose life was built on discipline, intellect, and reflection. Older residents recall him with a mixture of admiration and caution. Some remember the stability he brought, the rare moments of generosity, the careful orchestration that kept conflicts contained. Others speak of fear in tones subdued by time, the awareness of power exercised with invisible precision. Each memory is partial, filtered through the lens of personal experience, yet together they form a mosaic that hints at the magnitude of influence wielded quietly, deliberately, and without spectacle. Palermo itself, with its rhythm of markets, distant church bells, and sun-bleached facades, seems to hold these recollections as if they are an inherited weight, a silent narrative embedded in the everyday. Younger generations speak his name half in myth, half in curiosity, shaped by media, stories passed along street corners, and documentaries that attempt to capture what cannot be fully articulated. In their voices there is fascination but also distance, a recognition that power once so carefully exercised exists now as abstraction, an idea rather than a presence. The rhythm of life continues, indifferent to individual ambition, yet the lessons linger: patience, observation, and the quiet insistence of intellect over brute force. The atmosphere of the city itself mirrors the complexity of his legacy. Rain drifts across empty plazas and narrow stairways. The smell of damp stone mixes with the distant aroma of baking bread, of sea-salted wind carried inland. Sounds are softened footsteps on uneven pavement, a dog barking in the distance, voices murmuring behind closed shutters. In these moments, the city seems to breathe, carrying both the traces of history and the subtle persistence of those who shaped it. Pietro's life is felt in pauses between words, in unspoken lessons that extend beyond his physical presence, echoing in the consciousness of those who remember, those who study, and those who imagine. The observer learns that silence can be as resonant as action, that a carefully measured life leaves impressions in ways louder lives may never achieve. In homes and cafes, in quiet reflections by the sea, people recall stories, some fragmented, some embellished, all tinged with nuance. Aglieri's philosophy, his insistence on reason, order, and justification, becomes a prism through which actions are interpreted. He is remembered not for the force he exerted, but for the questions he posed through his life, the tension between morality and necessity, the balance of intellect and instinct, the quiet endurance of principle amid chaos. Listeners understand that his influence is measured not by headlines or spectacle, but by subtlety, by the unseen patterns he left behind, in both human behavior and communal memory. The city itself acts as narrator, moving slowly through narrow lanes, across stone bridges, and along piazzas where sunlight catches the dust and reflects fleetingly in the windows. Rain continues to fall, soft, persistent, cleansing and illuminating. In equal measure, memories converge here: childhood lessons, philosophical inquiry, decisions made in quiet rooms, the cumulative weight of leadership exercised with care. Each footstep on cobblestone resonates with echoes of deliberation, observation, and restraint. The moral complexity of Aglieri's life lingers in the mind as listeners contemplate How a man can enact both creation and destruction without noise, leaving the lasting impression of thoughtfulness rather than spectacle. By evening, Palermo glows under lamplight. Shadows stretch along alleyways, rooftops glimmer with reflected moisture, and the distant ringing of church bells punctuates the hush of the city. Pietro Aglieri's story is neither celebrated nor condemned here. It exists as reflection, as a meditation on the human condition. Power is understood as fleeting, influence as fragile, yet the echoes of deliberate, measured choices endure. Observers sense that life can be justified not only in triumph or failure, but in the careful calibration of thought and action, in the quiet pursuit of understanding one's own path, and in the acceptance of consequence without ostentation. As night deepens, rain falls softly on empty streets, carrying the lingering resonance of a man who moved with restraint and reason. Palermo holds its memories gently, refusing to allow clarity to resolve fully into judgment. Listeners are left with the quiet persistence of reflection, the subtle knowledge that life's complexity cannot be distilled to legend or condemnation. In these moments, Aglieri's voice is not heard but felt a philosopher's echo, resonating across time, space, and human consciousness, inviting contemplation of morality, power, and the delicate balance of a life lived quietly yet profoundly.